Welcome to our Land Center lecture series and the first lecture of this inaugural Land Center series. So thank you for coming, and let me open us up in a word of prayer, and then I will introduce our speaker. So let's pray together. Father, we come into your presence today, thankful for the opportunity to think about and listen to these lectures related to marriage and family. Father, we are grateful that you have shown us, not only in your word, but in our society, the place that marriage and family has. And so may the things that we learn over the course of today's lectures and tomorrow be helpful for our ministry, for engaging the culture, for understanding how we can have these conversations and promote marriage as you have designed it in the world in which you have placed us. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, I want to thank you for coming to this. This is hopefully the first of an annual series of lectures that we are planning on doing through the Land Center. And so our first lecture series for this year is related specifically to issues of marriage and family. Now, I want to introduce our speaker, and I want to get his book here so you can see this. So our speaker for this lecture series is Dr. Brad Wilcox. Dr. Wilcox is professor of sociology and director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia. I first encountered Dr. Wilcox's work several years ago and had the opportunity to read some of his work and saw a lot of the research that he was doing. Many of you who've had me for Christian Home will recognize you've seen his name in footnotes in your lecture notes and things like that, seen some of his charts put into your notes, because what he is doing is his work in sociology is attempting to show what we here at Southwestern would say is already revealed in Scripture, that God has designed marriage, that He's given a specific function and purpose for marriage and family and its role in society. And so what Dr. Wilcox is doing is coming alongside and through his research showing other ways that we can engage in the conversation and promote marriage and family, both on in the economic field, in the realm of politics, and social services, and the various things that he works on. And so this is really going to supplement what we teach here related to the home. Now, he's authored many books. I've just brought his most recent book to highlight today. And so this is called Soulmates: Religion, Sex, Love, and Marriage Among African Americans and Latinos. And so this is his most recent work published by Oxford University Press. And so he's highlighting the connections here, again, with religion and family and love, particularly in the African American and Latino context. But this is the type of work that Dr. Wilcox does. Dr. Wilcox travels all over the country and all over the world speaking on these issues. So it really is an honor to have him here with us. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Brad Wilcox.
Thank you, Evan. It's really an honor to be here today at the seminary and the college to speak about marriage and men. And I'm going to be debunking the ball and chain myth today in my comments. Marriage, it's not worth it. It's not worth the practical and financial sacrifices, the foregone romantic and sexual opportunities, and the lack of freedom. The benefits of marriage do little to counteract the massive cost men pay to get married. This is the message I got from Craig, a 29-year-old guy, and from dozens of men like him, after he listened to a lecture of mine on men and marriage that went viral on the internet. In his words, I'd much rather buy a $70,000 condo by the beach in Florida, working 10 to 20 hours a week with plenty of time and money to relax at the beach, sail, play golf and tennis, as well as hang out with friends, then marry a 30-year-old woman and take care of her into old age by working 50 hours a week at a job I don't like. Craig also stressed that he is in excellent physical condition because he isn't tied down to a regular 9-to-5 job like most married men. The fact is, my six-pack abs have gotten me far more sex with high-quality women in the prime than a man's six-figure income ever will. The sex is passionate, and did not require begging like a married man often have to do, as women are physically attracted to me rather than just interested in my ability to provide. Now, Craig's bill of particulars with marriage is long, and as you can tell, it's a bit extreme. But he does a good job of expressing a view that I've encountered among a lot of young men of late. Marriage, from their perspective, is a ball and chain of little benefit to the average guy, especially the kind of guy who lives for the moment and is devoted to the pleasure principle. Well, Craig is right about one thing. Marriage requires sacrifices, lots of them. After you get married, you've got to work harder, steer clear of attractive alternatives, spend less time with your buddies, and make a good faith effort, day in and day out, to be emotionally present to your spouse. Most men find these sacrifices hard. But all good things in life require sacrifice. Think about your own life. Raise your hand if you've ever played a varsity sport, performed center stage at a concert, climbed a 14er in Colorado, or written a book. Anyone done these things? Okay. You know that all good things in life require sacrifice. In fact, in talking up his six-pack abs, Craig made much of his intense workout regime. He's clearly willing to sacrifice for some things. In his case, a good body and the sexual variety it affords him. The point is this: our greatest accomplishments usually depend upon sacrifice. And marriage is no different. But the question that men like Craig ask is this: what is the marital ROI, the return on investment, for men? Is marriage worth the sacrifices that it requires? So first, let's talk about money. And contrary to the view that marriage is just a ball and chain for guys, I think it turns out the return on investment, both financially and in other ways that we'll talk about in a second, are quite substantial for the average man. I'm going to talk actually today about 4 different kinds of returns that men receive on the sacrifices that they make in marriage. And I focus here on men both because they tend to be less committed in unmarried relationships and less interested in marriage, but also I think men are the ones who need to hear this message the most. And because America's religious institutions have a language that includes words like sacrifice, commitment, and fidelity, I can think of no community better qualified to deliver this message to men, both as an encouragement to unmarried men and as a reminder to the married men, the sacrifices they are called to make are worth it. So in terms of money, let's consider the story of Doug Talby, a 37-year-old man from southern Ohio. As a young man, Doug was content to work a factory job paying close to minimum wage and to live in his parents' basement. Quote, "I really didn't have a care in the world," he said. "I really didn't have any bills." But after marrying and having some kids, Doug's perspective changed. "I had to step up, think about something besides myself, and start taking care of them." He quit his factory job, he joined the Army, and then sought regular opportunities to get promoted so as to provide his family with a better lifestyle. Recently, in a bid to further boost his family's income, he's left the Army and is now working at a car dealership as a finance manager, where he's pulling in 6 figures. So all of this has sort of taken place because, again, he thinks it's his responsibility to work hard in pursuit and fulfillment of his vows when it comes to marriage. And his experience is emblematic of the transformative effect that marriage has on men. After marrying, men typically work harder, they work smarter, and they make more money. We can see here, for instance, that the average single guy, both in his late 20s, over on the left here, and then in midlife in his 40s, works about 400 hours more than his peer single guy who has roughly equivalent credentials. So clearly there's a connection here between men and their commitment to work in terms of hours. We also know that men are more likely to be working strategically. So for instance, we see in the research, this is from Liz Gorman, work that she did when she was at Harvard, was that married men were much more likely, when they were unhappy with a job, to look around and find that second job before quitting their first job. By contrast, single guys are much more likely just to quit that first job and then to start looking around for a new job. And obviously the first strategy is much more prudent than the second strategy. She also found in her work, too, that when it came to who was fired, married men were much less likely to be fired than their single peers. Again, and she was controlling for a variety of characteristics in terms of things like race and ethnicity, age, and education that might otherwise explain why someone was being fired versus someone else. So this suggests, again, that marriage is helping men not only work more, but also work more prudently. And this then translates into more money. So we see that guys who are married make about $16,000 more than their single peers, both in their late 20s and in their mid-40s. And so there's a substantial kind of premium that follows for marriage for guys. Again, it's based upon more work hours, more prudent work, and a more strategic approach to the workplace. Now, when you mention statistics like this to sort of the new critics of marriage from the men's movement, they will often say, well, all this might be true, but isn't the case that this money ends up going to someone else besides themselves, to a wife and to kids? But what this, I think, perspective fails to sort of account for is kind of the long-term implications of marriage. Because by the time they reach retirement, men who've gotten and stayed married are in much better financial shape than their peers who were never married or who had gotten divorced. So really because they earn more and save more, and often have access today to a second income, what we see today is that stably married men are in a much better financial position as they move here into retirement. So this is just a graph, so we're looking at 50-something guys and their household assets, looking just at sort of median patterns here, kind of the guy in the middle of the pack here in America. You can see that men who are in their first marriages are in a much better position financially as they sort of approach retirement. Again, these are guys in their 50s, compared to men on the left who've never been married and compared to men who've been divorced on the right. So what these kinds of statistics suggest to us is that the financial return on investment for men when it comes to marriage are pretty substantial when it comes to both their investment in their careers, their income, and their position moving towards retirement. But sure, money matters, but of course I think for many men, sex matters even more. Of course, that was Craig's comment at the beginning of my talk today. And so, this leads us to think about this question. Does married sex measure up? Or is it as passionless and pathetic as Craig contends? Now, when it comes to frequency, it is the case that men who cohabit do have an advantage. According to the General Social Survey, 52% of cohabiting young men have sex at least twice a week, compared to 42% of married men. But it's also the case that single men have the least sex, with only 37% of single guys in their 20s and 30s having that much sex. We kind of turn away from this question about frequency and look towards this issue of quality. We see a different story. So in the National Health and Social Life Survey, which is conducted by the University of Chicago, we can see here clearly that men are more satisfied with the emotional quality of their sex compared to their cohabiting and to their single peers. Also the case, of course, you can see here for women as well. It's not just the emotional quality that we see this story here playing out, but it's also the physical quality of sex. We can see again that married men are reporting greater satisfaction with the physical quality of their sex compared to their cohabiting and to their single peers. So these findings, of course, run counter to about every movie, sitcom, and YouTube video that I've seen. Right? We don't kind of get this message from the pop culture, as you were saying this morning in chapel. So what's going on here? Well, I think guys benefit from the sexual investments that marriage encourages on both parties. And this idea comes out in a story from a nurse, Beth. She was kind of reflecting on her experience in this domain of her marriage. She'd been married for more than a decade. She explained kind of what was happening in her marriage when it came to sex in this way. Quote, "I think for sex you need more time. Time to get in sync, time to know your partner, time to get to know what the other person likes or doesn't like." So contrary to the stereotype of married men begging their wives for sex then, what we see in the real world is that good sex is often built on the sacrifices that spouses make for one another, both inside and, of course, outside of the bedroom. I should also just mention right here that another report that I did found that when it came to sexual satisfaction for both men and for women, reports of commitment, generosity, shared housework and childcare, and faith were excellent predictors of higher quality sex for both husbands and wives. But it's sort of in line with this point here that we're talking about now for men. So men just don't have a better sex life when they're married. They also are more likely to enjoy better health. What we see in the research is that men who get and stay married live almost 10 years longer than their unmarried peers. And a recent Harvard study found that even among men diagnosed with cancer, the married ones are living longer in the wake of that diagnosis. So what's going on here? Well, I think here the companionship, the support, and even the nagging that us men get from our wives to go see a doctor all translate into better physical health. Our immune systems also function better when we have support from loved ones. Wives also tend to push doctors and nurses to give their husbands better care when they're in the hospital. Married men are more likely to be encouraged, obviously, on a regular basis to see a doctor when there's some kind of affliction, physical affliction in their lives. So in all these ways, we're seeing that marriage as an institution is fostering better health for men. Now, there is, of course, one important exception to link between marriage and health for men, where you're actually doing better when you're single as opposed to married. What exception do you think that might be? Any guesses on that score? No? Obesity, yes. So married men, we're about 10 or 15 more pounds on average than our equivalent single peers. And I can certainly attest to that reality in my own life. Okay, so that's the exception, okay? Now, it's not just about the physical side, but it's also about kind of the emotional side. Because what we see when it comes to marriage in men's lives is that they're doing better emotionally. Married men experience less depression and more happiness than bachelors. The GSS tells us about 7% of married men are not happy compared to 16% of their unmarried peers. You can see here, when it comes to being very happy, that married guys are much more likely to be very happy compared to their single and their cohabiting peers. Now, of course, all of us know here in this room, that it's not the case that life is simply happily ever after, after the wedding day. This is not like a kind of a magic talisman that just sort of puts a smile on your face at all times. We know that the average marriage has plenty of ups and downs. Anyone who's been married knows that there are many difficult days in married life. Real relationships with imperfect people are hard. But over the long term, men benefit from having a companion for the journey. In the words of one middle-aged man spotlighted in the book, Staying the Course, quote, "If I weren't married, I'd probably have one hell of a time. I'd probably spend my summers in Newport and my winters on the Caribbean." But he went on to say, much as I wouldn't want to admit it, I'd probably be lonesome with life, because I know quite a few guys that got divorced. When it really comes down to, a lot of them go home at night to a cold home. His comment reminds us that sacrificing summers in Newport means that he has the privilege of coming home back to a warm home every night. Okay? So again, the point here is that kind of over the arc of one's life, there are clear benefits to remaining stably married when it comes both to your physical health and your emotional health from it. So again, this is one more return on the investment that men typically garner from marriage. So I've listed 3 ways in which men themselves, I think, benefit from the sacrifices they make in marriage. My 4th point bears more on the children that men typically have, even today. So we see today that about 8 in 10 men will end up becoming a father at some point in their lives. And, marriage is generally a way that we connect men to their children. and this is not an evangelical point, this is not a Catholic point, this is not a Jewish point, this is really a human point. If you look kind of across civilizations, across history, again, marriage is the way in which civilizations connect men to their children. And this basic fact, this basic insight is applicable also to our own country, to our own society. So we see here, for instance, and there's a lot going on in this figure, but, and actually this is also somewhat encouraging. This is looking at how much non-residential dads are in contact with their children. And the bottom consistent line right here is weekly contact. You can see it's been going up, thankfully, since the 1970s, to the point where it's about probably 32%. So that's good, it's up. But clearly, this also is telling us this still today, most non-residential fathers don't see their kids on a weekly basis, which is just striking, right? Okay. So the point here is that marriage is an institution in America, but really across the world, that connects men to their kids. And this connection with their kids is profoundly important. When it comes to sons, for instance, we can see here is that boys who are growing up with their fathers are markedly less likely to end up in prison or in jail by the time they turn 30. Whereas boys who are living apart from their fathers, and this gets to the single mother, but it also applies to step-families as well, actually, are about twice as likely to end up in prison or in jail at some point before they turn 30, compared to their peers who've had the benefit of being raised by their own married mother and father back at home. So again, not having access to a father's attention, not having access to his modeling kind of appropriate anger, not having access to a father's kind of watching who you're hanging out with and is waiting for you back at home when you're past curfew, as has happened in our household on a few occasions. These things matter for boys. And so when they don't have that father in the picture, they're much more likely to run afoul of the law. But dads matter for daughters as well. And what we can see here is that young women who have been raised apart from their father are more likely to become pregnant as teenagers. So obviously the idea, again, is that not having your dad's attention, not having your dad kind of monitoring your friends and the boys in your life or the young men in your life puts you at risk. And most fundamentally what the research tells us is that not having a high-quality relationship as a teenage girl with your father is an extraordinarily powerful predictor of having both early sex and ending up pregnant as a teenager. So again, marriage is that institution that helps connect men to their kids, helps connect men to their daughters in this case in ways that are protective for their daughters. So these statistics aren't just simply abstract stats for me. I was raised without a father, and though my mom did a great job with me and my sister, my life was certainly marked by its share of nevers. I never got to play ball with my dad in the backyard. I never endured the birds and the bees lecture from him. I never got to see a man and a woman forging a lifelong marriage amidst the ups and downs of life. All of these nevers have left kind of an indelible mark on me. To this day, for instance, I can barely distinguish the Cowboys from the Texans. But seriously, my own sort of experience and perspective here with fatherlessness has left me convinced that sacrifices that men make in and for marriage have priceless long-term payoffs, not just for themselves, but also for their children. That's sort of the fourth kind of benefit or a return that marriage has for men and for their children. Now, I've been making obviously a case for marriage as pretty important for men in America today. But I want to also kind of give you the caveat to all of this. And this is a caveat that I'm much more attentive to now because there's so many men who kind of respond to the points that I've just made from a place of both sort of anger and hurt. And so this is the caveat we need to think about for a second here. So the science couldn't be clearer. On average, men and their kids are more likely to flourish when they get and stay married. But especially today, marriage is not without its risks. Foremost among them, obviously, is divorce. So today, about 42% of first marriages end in divorce. The majority of these divorces are initiated by women. This means that a large minority of men who marry will end up unwillingly divorced. These men obviously don't reap many of the rewards from the sacrifices that I've just been talking about. So let me say this, as we kind of think about this issue of divorce. I think we need to be sort of encouraging men to be much more aware of the risk that divorce plays, in their lives, in their worlds, in their marriages, and to be aware of some of the basic insights that we have from research about things that men can do, not to eliminate, obviously, the risk of divorce, but to reduce or to minimize the risk of divorce in their lives. And so I'm going to mention just 5 things that are worth keeping in mind for men who are pursuing the vocation to marriage. So the first thing that I would say is it's really important to do all that you can to seek and, if at all possible, it's not always possible, to maintain stable employment. In fact, I was just talking to an Uber driver this morning, unfortunately, who mentioned that he had gotten divorced in the wake of the Great Recession after he kind of lost his job as a trucker. So sometimes these things obviously are beyond our control, but it is important, I think, for guys to be either to be employed or to be, looking for work, if at all possible. The second thing I would mention is that it's pretty clear that substance use plays a major role in many divorces. So it's also obviously important to steer clear of drugs. And I'm Catholic, and excessive use, obviously, of alcohol. So again, kind of steering clear of substance abuse is also the second point I'd make for married men when it comes to avoiding divorce. The third point, and this is in the spirit of this morning's chapel meditation, is sexual fidelity is obviously also an important predictor of marital stability. So remaining faithful to your vows obviously increases your odds of making it to the finish line. The fourth point is that, and this is, I think, particularly important today, is that men who make a regular effort to be emotionally engaged in their marriages, who are affectionate, who are thankful, who are attentive, are much more likely to have happy wives and stable marriages. Now, again, this is sort of commonsensical, right? But it is the case, I think, that after the wedding day, for a lot of guys, after you've kind of, you've gotten over that threshold, you can take your wife for granted and you can take your marriage for granted. And so you have to kind of be continually thinking about, being emotionally engaged and being attentive to the emotional well-being of your spouse. The final thing I'll mention today is the role of religion. And you probably have heard that Barna once observed that Christians were as likely to get divorced as non-Christians in America. And that is true if you're looking at it just in terms of people's identification. But when you kind of look at different indicators, different predictors, what you see is that that's not true. So for Americans who are attending regularly religious services, they're about 40% less likely to get divorced, depending upon the kind of study that you're looking at. And here I've got some research from Tyler Vanderweel at Harvard Public Health, and he's been tracking thousands of nurses over time across America. And what he finds is that nurses who are regularly attending church are about 45% less likely to get divorced than their fellow nurses who are not regularly attending. And they're sort of in the middle of the occupational and income distribution on many kinds of outcomes. So there's sort of a pretty good group to take a look at here in American life. So again, 5 points about work and about substance use, about sex, about emotional engagement, and about faith that it's important for men to keep in mind if they're hoping to steer clear of divorce court and reap the kinds of returns that I've been mentioning today when it comes to marriage. So we've seen today that for the average guy, marriage has significant returns in the sacrifices that it requires when it comes to money, sex, health, and fatherhood. It's all of a piece with what one major research project, the Harvard Study of Adult Development, found about when it comes to making men healthier and happier over the course of their lives. The director of that study, Robert Waldinger, summed up the results in this way. Over and over in these 75 years, our study has shown that the people who fared the best were the people who leaned into relationships with family, with friends, and with community. The Harvard study reminded me of my grandfather, Brad Hastings. He leaned into his marriage, his kids, grandkids, and friends with a spirit of faithful service and shared with them his wise conversation, wry humor, and occasional baritone singing. And it showed. Brad was a much beloved husband, father, grandfather, and friend. But early in his 70s, his body began to waste away as Lou Gehrig's disease wreaked havoc, first on his arms and then gradually upon his respiratory system. Now, Craig, I might call him Six-Pack Craig from the beginning here, might be interested to learn that my grandfather died with a six-pack of his own, and with the admiration of many women, including his wife, his daughters, and 5 granddaughters. But their admiration for him had nothing to do with his body, and almost everything to do with the sacrifices that he had made for his wife, family, and friends. The evident love of 3 generations was the ultimate return on his investment in marriage and family life. And so it goes, I think, for many men who are fortunate enough to face death with a good marriage and a good family life in the rearview mirror. This, then, is the kind of story that pastors, priests, and rabbis, not to mention ordinary lay people, need to tell men like Craig, both in and outside of the pews. The takeaway here, then, is this. A life lived according to the pleasure principle in love and relationships, as with so much else, does not compare to a life lived sacrificially for others. That's especially true, as we've seen today, when you take the long view of life and love. Thank you.
Now we have time for some questions with Dr. Wilcox. So if you will raise your hand, and when I get to you with the microphone, if you'll state your name and where you are from so that Dr. Wilcox can know with whom he is speaking, and then state your question succinctly so we can cover as many questions as possible.
Hi, I'm Robert Lopez, and I'm from right here in Southwestern. I was just wondering, with a lot of the statistics, what would you say to the objection that the causation might be the opposite, that people who don't get left by their wives are people who are already naturally in good jobs? So the stable marriages are an effect of those other things that are really just people's personality traits, et cetera.
That's a great point. So I think certainly part of the story here is what we call selection effects in the research, where the kinds of guys today who are getting married and staying married tend to be more likely to have the kinds of traits that would make for an attractive spouse, either in terms of their ability to make money, or because today upper middle class Americans are much more likely to get and stay married than our lower class and working class Americans, or have certain kinds of abilities when it comes to communication that make them a better prospect. So that's certainly part of the story, but I would also suggest to you that the research indicates that marriage transforms men as well, that marriage has a causal impact on men as well. So we see, for instance, that when men actually are approaching the wedding day, they're working more hours than they were, and they were kind of completely sort of single, so to speak. And that when men get divorced, unfortunately, they tend to cut back their hours. They tend to be less engaged in their work. It's sort of one indication when it comes to sort of the connection between men, marriage, and work. That there's sort of a change that happens over the life course that's consistent with a more causal view about the impact that marriage has on men's lives. Also seen some work using twin studies now, more recently. This is sort of the newest methodological innovation. And so you're comparing identical twins, fraternal twins. Obviously, you've got the same family background, same basic class background. And what they're seeing is that for the twins, the guys who are getting married tend to be using less substances in the wake of a marriage. So, and what we see actually over the life course is that guys who get married spend less time over the weekend in taverns and bars and more time in churches, after they get married. So there's a kind of, it looks like a causal impact of marriage on men's socials. But it's important, again, to acknowledge there's both kind of a selection effect here in play and a institutional effect on individual men. But the other thing that I want to mention, too, is kind of about the more ecological story here. So to think about not just what does marriage mean for individual men, but what does it mean for communities? And what we see in the work of Raj Chetty, who was at Harvard, now is at Stanford, is that at the ecological level, at the community level, communities with more two-parent homes, with effectively more married men in the household, enjoy a lot more mobility for poor kids. That is, poor kids who are at the 20th percentile growing up are much more likely to be in the top 20th percentile as adults when they're coming from communities with more married men in the picture, more two-parent households in the picture. So for instance, a metro area like Salt Lake has much more mobility for poor kids than a metro area like Atlanta. And part of that's about family structure in those two different metro areas. We also see, too, that family structure is linked to crime rates. So communities with a lot more dads in the neighborhood are much safer than communities with fewer dads. So my point here simply is that we're talking about kind of the impact of marriage on men's lives. It's not just sort of their individual lives that we're talking about, as I did today, but we can also sort of think about how it extends to their impact on their communities and its implications for, again, economic mobility, public safety, and even education in those communities as well.
My name is Roderick Sproul. I'm from Oklahoma City. Thank you for your demographic unity within your visions or visuals. But my question would be, what were some of the influences that would influence the success and failure in marriage for men?
In terms of, so what's likely to basically increase the quality and stability of marriage for men today?
Such as community, the way one may have grown up at home and or what they've seen at home, what they experience in the community, education. What were some of the influences for the success and failure?
Okay, so in terms of, when you look at both the quality and stability of family life today in America, and this is, based on really sort of what do we see, frankly, just sort of running regressions, So I'm just crunching numbers and sort of seeing what factors are more predictive of higher marital quality really for women today, but that has obvious implications for men as well. So the things that I see would be first and foremost, his emotional engagement, as I mentioned before, in the marriage. So his capacity to be affectionate, empathetic, et cetera, is the most important predictor of her marital quality. Has also implications for marital stability. Having high levels of joint commitment, where they are committed both to the relationship itself, but also to marriage per se. So couples who are more likely to reject, for instance, easy divorce, also more likely to invest practically and emotionally in their marriages and to enjoy higher levels of marital quality. So commitment, again, both to the institution and to the person is very important here when it comes to marriage. We also see when it comes to religion that, I'll talk more about this tonight, but that kind of shared religious practice when it comes to attendance is a good predictor of marital quality. But even more than that, shared prayer apart from grace at meals is a great predictor of marital quality, and I would suspect probably marital stability as well. When it comes to work and family, there's a kind of a nuanced story there today. So on the one hand, as progressives might expect, reports of sharing housework and childcare are linked to higher quality marriages, but also for people who've got kids in the household, having him earn the lion's share of the income is also predictive of higher quality marriages. So it's kind of a subtle point there about, when men are in the house, so they need to be really engaged, not watching ESPN or whatever else. I mean, there's a place for that, right? But it's the occasional thing, not the it's not constantly on the television. And then in terms of other things that we see for marital quality and stability, I would also say, and this is unfortunate, I alluded to this earlier in my comments with respect to Professor Lopez, but we all see that men and women who are college educated today are much more likely to enjoy more stable marriages and also happier marriages. And I think it's partly because they tend to enjoy more stable employment, more income, but also they tend to have better social skills. And today's marriages are more, I think, demanding in terms of what spouses are expecting one another when it comes to communication and relationships. So there's also kind of a class component to this as well in the research. And then the final thing I would mention in terms of money, again, is that we do see that couples who have more shared assets and couples who have less consumer debt are happier. What's interesting about this particular story, it's not completely a class story. So you see there are plenty of upper middle class Americans who are living, large, so to speak, and have high levels of debt, and that's not good for them. And there are plenty of working class folks who are living within their means, and they're doing better on this score. So a kind of a spirit of frugality, if you will, is also linked to higher quality, more stable marriages as well.
Hello, David Chin, currently Arlington, Texas. About you showed the graph or the chart about the regular religious attendance and the benefits. You mentioned it was from the nursing study. Is that, do those data show the men in the nursing study? Because I thought that was predominantly women.
Yeah, that was done with women, but it's just one example of a kind of pattern. I've also done some work with the NSFH looking at, that was 35%. So for those who are regularly attending, this is both for women and men, they are 35% less likely to get divorced compared to those who never attended religious services. So, but this is kind of the most recent thing I've seen in the religion and divorce. So.
Hi, I'm Daniel Kim. Thank you so much for your time. I was wondering what the implications are of the data that you just presented on the benefits of singlehood, whether they imply anything at all, and that specifically in relation to what we read in 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul says marriage is good, but singlehood is better. So do you have any commentary on that? Thanks.
Sure, that's a great question. So I would say that not everyone is called to marriage, and that it is I think, the vocation that most men will receive. But I think we are all called to community. And so I think it's really important to recognize that both as a single person, if you were called to that single vocation, that you're called to live in some kind of community. It's also important for people who are married to sort of recognize that they're called to embrace that spirit of community and to incorporate and include single people into their lives, as a consequence. So I think there's a kind of a universal call to community, and that manifests itself differently for married and for single people, is what I would say.
Hi, my name is Drew. I'm an MDiv student here, originally from North Carolina. This is a little bit of a different question, but obviously you've given us lots of sort of rote facts. Like this is statistical, scientific fact. But have you seen, how has this affected you in your lecturing? I mean, clearly the state of current American higher education in the public sphere, the culture wars in relation to gender and sexuality, has this affected places you can and can't lecture? Have you received like pushback from this just because it's really culturally unpopular and not necessarily because you're wrong?
Well, certainly in sociology, which is my discipline, the kind of perspective that I take is unpopular in some quarters. It's a more progressive discipline on the whole. And so the kinds of things that I've said today would be seen as offensive or wrong-headed in my discipline. So certainly there's been some pushback, on the internet and the like, for these kinds of remarks and comments. And I've had some professional difficulties as well. But that's just sort of par for the course today in 2017. And I think if you are pursuing a vocation, whether it's in medicine or education or business, you're going to find navigating these types of issues is more and more challenging in 21st century America. And so it's important to, I think, be aware of that reality, prepare for it as best you can to try to sort of understand the secular arguments, that might support your perspective. And this lecture, I think, today would hopefully kind of give people who are interested in kind of explaining and defending marriage to their, their secular or progressive peers, who have sort of that ability. But anyways, what I'm just sort of saying is that, yeah, there is certainly pushback in some quarters, and so you have to kind of be ready for that, prepare for it, and be willing to engage people and recognize some people are going to be very angry if you say things like this in public.
Ross Inman here at Southwestern. I'm curious if there's any contemporary research that would, well, a couple things. One, is there any contemporary research that would speak to same-sex arrangements regarding the marriage union? And then, because I know we've seen a lot of great work coming out of with respect to children of same-sex arrangements, but is there anything in the works? I know just with we're on the advent of the legalization of same-sex marriage, but
Sure.
Can you foresee anything coming down the pipeline in terms of studying marriage between same-sex couples and the objective measures that would be used to assess the results of those sorts of unions as well? Or if there's any of these results that you find to be specifically tied to the heterosexuality of the union itself. That makes sense.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think kind of our study of same-sex marriage is more embryonic, for obvious reasons, than our study of marriage between heterosexuals is. I would say that, I guess I'd make 3 points about this. One is that in terms of the stability, I do think that same-sex married relationships are more stable than unmarried same-sex relationships. And it's just kind of a sociological point that when you institutionalize something, oftentimes it becomes more stable. But the second point is I think that they're going to be less stable than heterosexual relationships because they're not bringing together people who have a kind of a different sort of, orientation and experience of the world in some important respects. And then the third point, and it's related to the second point, is that we also have to recognize that gay relationships are different than lesbian relationships. And that's because, on average, men are different than women. And so sort of the way in which they approach their relationships will be different. And there's some preliminary evidence on this score that at least among the more committed same-sex relationships, it's actually lesbians who face more instability. And when I first came across this finding, I was a bit surprised by it. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense to me. And the reason it made sense to me as I sort of, was thinking through this finding is that when I first went to graduate school, I had this idea that sort of the average divorce was sort of the 40-year-old guy who kind of was heading into his midlife crisis, getting the red sports car, divorcing his wife, and marrying his secretary. I mean, this is sort of, back in the 1990s, so it's a little dated. But as I was going through graduate school, I realized this is not the average scenario. Not the average scenario. The average scenario is that you have a marriage where a couple's been married, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years, and there's some difficulty, some disappointment, some conflict, some anger, some seeing someone in your world that's a little bit more exciting than your spouse. And in the average sort of scenario, it's often the wife who is initiating divorce for any number of reasons. And so with that kind of perspective in mind, I came to sort of the conclusion that I think maybe lesbian relationships perhaps are less stable. This is based upon some research in Sweden and some new research done in the United States, because perhaps women have a higher kind of expectation of intimacy in their relationships. They have more capacity to monitor kind of what's happening in their relationship. I mean, my wife could give you a list of 20 things that I've done badly in the last 3 days, right? Okay? And I couldn't give you one thing that she's done badly in the last 3 days, right? So these dynamics, I think, might be playing out ways for lesbians that are a little bit different than they are for gay men. So anyways, going forward, I would sort of predict that at least in the more committed relationships, in same-sex marriages and heterosexual marriages, that on average, heterosexual marriages will be more stable, particularly in comparison to lesbian, marriages. That's my prediction. But we'll have to wait, really, well, actually I'd say about 10 more years to get some better longitudinal data on heterosexual and same-sex marriages.
Maybe time for one more.
My question is the 5 things that you listed. The 5 things that you listed for application at the end, are those listed in order as importance or just 5 things to application?
No, just 5. I mean, I think I think when it comes to avoiding divorce, I would certainly say that share religious practice. And I'm not just saying that because I'm at a Baptist seminary, but I think just objectively, share religious practice is very important. And also a shared normative commitment to marital permanence. I mean, I guess it's not rocket science, but I think people, when they fall in love and they're heading towards the altar, they're not thinking about these things. Often, the average American is not thinking about these things. But given the fact that 42% of first marriages end in divorce in America, I think it would be wise for people to be thinking a lot more about these things on the front end. And so marrying someone who shares your faith, and marrying someone who is committed to regular religious practice, and who is also committed to marriage as a lifelong institution, or in your probably Christian covenant, is very, from a purely secular perspective, is very prudent because of the fragility of married life today. And especially for guys, recognizing that the average divorce is issued by women, you should be thinking about these issues on the front end and not regretting them on the back end, sort of how I would respond to that.
All right, if you'd join me in thanking Dr. Wilcox for his time with us today. Our last task is, as we typically do, and I've warned him already, I have to exclude Dr. Lopez and Dr. Inman. They make enough money to buy their own books.
Yeah.
But we have a $50 gift card for the most insightful question of the day. So which one would you like that to go to?
The gentleman in the green sweatshirt with the question about, how does this affect my profession?
All right, Drew, if you'll see me when it's all over, I've got a gift card for you. Just real quick, just to highlight tonight, do you want to give us a quick tease for tonight's lecture?
You want to grab this, but I'm not used to that. So, the tease for tonight's lecture is that I'll just say I got an email this summer from a scholar in Australia asking me about religion and domestic violence. I'm like, what is this all about? Why am I getting an email out of the blue in the middle of the summer about religion and domestic violence? Turns out that there was a major series both on sort of on this website, this news site, and on one of their leading news programs on Christianity and domestic violence in Australia. And it painted a pretty harrowing portrait of the influence of Christianity on marriages, relationships in Australia. And so I'm going to be reflecting upon how this particular news story which was in Australia, is going to be, I think this kind of news story is going to be coming to America. You know, this, a version of this kind of news story more and more often in the next, decade. And to talk about, why it's going to be coming and how we can respond in our thinking to this kind of view, that when it comes to women, children, and families, religion in general and Christianity in particular is a baleful force in our societies. I think that's all. I'll be talking about that tonight in my lecture.
Right. Well, that'll be tonight at 7 o'clock over in the new Mathena Hall Auditorium. So please join us for that. We'll have a dessert reception at the conclusion of that one. And then tomorrow morning, we'll have our final lecture at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning in the Mathena Hall Auditorium. And he'll be talking about cohabitation in that one and its effects on our society. And then also mark your calendar coming up on November the 29th. We'll have our final Land Center lecture of the semester, and that will be with Dr. Ethan Jones, and he'll be looking at the land, famine, and foreigners in the book of Ruth. And so mark that on your calendar, 11:30 on November 29th. So please, again, thank Dr. Wilcox for joining us, and you're dismissed.